Okay, class, welcome back. This is the part 3 of chapter 10 notes. This is the High Middle Ages in Europe from 1000 to 1300. This is covering pages 480 through 488. If you haven't watched the video, the crash course video on the Crusades, you need to make sure that you watch it at the same time that you're doing this one, because it is covered in this section. The Crusades are. Okay, after centuries of Muslim and Viking and Magyar attacks, security settled into Europe. This era of economic, political, and demographic growth is known as the High Middle Ages. If you remember from the last video, we talked about the three different forms of periodization that the Middle Ages went through: the early Middle Ages, the High Middle Ages, and the late Middle Ages. So understand that there was peace and stability that took place during this time, and things started to get a little bit better. Essential to economic growth was the revival of trade routes. Regional routes connected the British Isles to the coast and onto the Baltic Sea. Rivers connected the coast to the interior, and the cities of the Mediterranean were established as circuits of commerce. As you see on the map, you see all of the different routes that trade went through during this medieval period. So make sure you understand that all of these were trade centers. We talked about in the last chapter about Constantinople, or earlier in the chapter about Constantinople being one of those major cities, and you see that many of those routes went through Constantinople. Also understand that these large European trade fairs were held. Merchants from the northern and southern Europe met with trade products from their respective areas. So they were bringing things that could be traded with others throughout southern and northern Europe. Here you see photos of different trade fairs that took place. You see all the people would come to the trade fairs to trade their goods. A lot of this trade led to a growth in banking, and you start to see the advent or the start of banks during this time period. The money changers exchanged one currency for another, so you have a medium of trade as far as currency was concerned. You also had people who took deposits. That's what the bank was doing, and they were arranging loans for people who needed money to continue to run their businesses. And then it also set up ways to transfer money from one place to another, change the money into the type of money they would need along their trade routes. Because of all of this happening, you have increased population as a result, and you have increased urbanization. Many more people were starting to move towards the cities. You have the growth of the cities and towns with different types of people that were in them. These types of people included merchants, bankers, artisans, lawyers, doctors, and scholars. So you start to see people moving toward the city to make sure that they're in the know in the cities and doing the things they need to do in those territories. You also have the growth of what we call guilds. And as it shows, guilds are business associations that are organized by merchants and artisans in the same line of work. For example, you may have the shoemakers guild, or the blacksmiths guild, or some other type of associations as far as those are concerned. They were created rules concerning the foreign trading, how goods were priced, different wages that were paid, etc. Now, these guilds were controlled by what they call masters, and these were the people who owned those shops and owned those tools. So they were the artisans who mainly were the leaders in those specific cities. Also, another part of the guilds were the people who started to work in those guilds, how they moved up to be those masters. First, they would be an apprentice, and they would work for a master in order to learn what the job was, what the craft was. And as an apprentice, they were not being paid. Once they got to a certain point, the apprentice becomes a journeyman. A journeyman. So they would be a person who would go from place to place and do the same type of work that the masters were doing, and at this point they would be able to receive some pay. And then to become a master, they had to submit a sample of their work to the guild, which was a committee for the guild's approval. Once the guild approved this, then they could become a master in whatever guild they were in. Also, a number of towns in Western Europe grew tremendously. We talked about population growing, people moving to the cities, things like that for trade reasons and to join the guilds. But they also built walls around the towns for protection from invaders, from all of the different other places that were trying to come in. Most of their buildings were made of wood, so these became kind of fire hazards. And as you see here, a picture of a medieval town during the High Middle Ages. You see it's fairly compact. You see there are a lot of people doing different things, having different trades, buildings taking place, and you always going to be close to a water source. But everything was going on in the town. Because of all of these people coming to towns, these cities became dirty and they smelled terribly. And you didn't have a way of sanitizing. So because of those different things, it led to the garbage and the sewers being tossed in the streets. And you have different rapid spreads of disease, such as typhoid, and the flu, influenza, and also malaria. And some of these could become epidemics, meaning that it spread through the town very quickly, and a lot of people were getting, just like we have our flu season, and a lot of people catching the flu. The same thing happened in these towns. The worst of these was called the Black Death, and we know it as the bubonic plague from 1348 to 1350. We talked about it a little bit earlier, where it traveled through on the backs of rats, mainly through trade, and it killed 1/3 of the population in Europe. You see pictures, some of these are paintings of how the Black Death was described during this time period. One of our songs that you learned as a child actually came from the Black Death, Ring Around the Rosie. So let's think about what the song says. It says, ring around the Rosie. That pretty much means this disease kind of had little rings on your body, and that would show the boils and the things like that, and they would kind of be in a ring formation. Pocket full of posies. They believed that you should wear certain flowers that had a good fragrance to keep the smell and the stench of the disease off of you. Ashes. The people that were dying, they were pretty much burned, cremated, so that that disease wouldn't spread. And then we all fall down. The people were dying at an alarming rate. They think that everybody was going to die from that disease. Now, this section, I'm going to kind of let it just go on through, because you will have watched the video, the crash course video on the Crusades. So what I want you to do is really just kind of take notes from this. The main thing that I want you to get from this were some of the results of the Crusades. And you'll see on the video how the Crusades came about, the course of the 9 holy wars of the Crusades that took place, understanding it was between the Christians and the Muslims, and in the event of wanting to spread Christianity. You see the map here that shows some of the Crusades that took place. Different people who went into the Crusades, participated, and what they received if they did participate. Some of the most famous Crusades different targets of the Crusaders. Like it talks about the Muslims, the lands along the Baltic Sea, moving toward the Byzantine Empire, those people who were enemies of the Pope, and the opponents of the Catholic Church. So let's think about some of the things that came out of the Crusades. And like I said, you'll watch the video, and you'll probably, this is kind of should be a little bit of a redundancy or something that you've seen before. But the Crusades were relatively unsuccessful. They kicked up a lot of dust, and a lot of people lost lives and different things like that. But in the overall scheme of things, they didn't have a very lasting impact. They did increase the power of the Pope, and because they were going to the Islamic world, you had a high demand for Asian goods and Muslim scholarship. So a lot of cultural diffusion was passed along throughout these crusades, these battles and things like that, because you had a lot of contact with the outside world. Also, some of the results of the Crusades had brought a greater rift between Eastern Orthodox and the Roman Catholicism, like we talked about earlier in the chapter. You had a growth of anti-Semitism, meaning that more and more people were going against the Jews, and they were blaming the Jews for a lot of things that were taking place. And then it solidified cultural barriers, meaning that they didn't, people were sticking more closely to some of the things that they held as far as beliefs were concerned. Crusades did give Europeans exposure to new goods such as sugar and spice and ideas from Islamic technology as far as Greek learning was concerned. Now this is going to end this third portion of the chapter. You will still have some questions that you're going to need to answer, but make sure that you watch the Crusades video also. And then we'll just kind of see how we go into the next portion.